Yes, I am a solicitor in the real estate team at Capital Law, and most of my work relates to de-risking property transactions, often in relation to land contamination. But it strikes me over the past year or so, when I've been looking more closely at climate risk, that it absolutely dwarfs contaminated land, albeit it seems amorphous and it's a long-term risk. When we look, as we will do in a moment, at the scale of this problem and the number of properties affected, we're going to be encountering this a great deal in our day-to-day practice. Frankly, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of properties are at risk from climate in the medium to longer term. So here's a slide. I'll try and talk through it as best I can. My background before private practice, I worked in the city with Allianz, insuring environmental risk, contaminated sites in particular. And the challenge there was to sort of put a price on whether a risk was insurable, a premium. And albeit my background as a lawyer, when I was working with insurers, you get to see a risk in a different light. And insurers, it's very mathematical, monetizes risk. It doesn't just say there's a low risk or there's a high risk. It's there's a risk that it could cost you X amount of money, and on the basis of that, we derive a premium. So this table just takes sort of 3 or 4, let's call them geo-environmental risks. The top one is the Part 2A notice, so where Stephen and I have been busy over the years, and Keith and lots of other lawyers here probably, advising clients on contaminated land liability. That's a complex area, but at the sharp pointy end, it's the service of a statutory notice where you have to remediate the site to make it safe. And it can be very expensive. I put this number up here for with residential properties in mind, and the best stat I've got is if you have a Part 2A site with a residential, it's around about £50,000. Along the bottom are the number of homes across the UK. Oh, okay. So across the UK, bear in mind, 28 million homes, and you're conveying what, a million and a half a year potentially. But look at that first risk then, the prospect of a client being served a Part 2A notice. I think it's happened less than 1,000 times across the whole of the UK, but the latest stats aren't there, and it costs you £50,000, and that law's been in for 20 years. It is a risk. We can't ignore that risk. If it hits the client, it's problematic, and we have the environmental search industry partly created to mitigate that risk. But then if we go a little bit further along, and this is before climate change impacts, coastal erosion, I think about 10,000 properties in the UK at risk with a 7,500 mile coastline. The risk there, of course, is not 50,000, it's that you lose your home. It's a total loss. So if it happens, and it's more likely to happen than contaminated land, the consequence is greater. It's a bigger risk in sort of insurance terms, if you like. But then we look at the two big ones which occupy the banks, the lending community. We've had Rob on from the Nationwide. I think Barclays put a report out in 2021 where they say the main areas they're concerned about, certainly from a climate risk standpoint, are subsidence through the drier conditions that we're hearing about, and some of those scary numbers at 2050. Round about the million mark at the moment, properties affected by subsidence, 1.5 million, a big number. £50,000, £10,000 to £50,000 is the average price to fix subsidence in a residential property. But flooding is out there with actually, I think 5.8 million homes across the UK have a 1 in 100 year chance of a flooding event, even now, not even factoring in climate risk. So then, and I haven't got the slide to show this, but if we do factor in climate risk, the contaminated land doesn't really move. It's very marginal where the climate will increase the risk of you being served with a Part 2A notice. An extreme weather event could mobilise contamination in the landfill. Yes, so there's some, perhaps remote scenarios, but by and large, that risk is not going to be affected too much. But if we look at coastal erosion, and you've got the stats in the Groundshaw brochure here, we go from roughly 10,000, admittedly over a 50-year period, but nearer term projections are possible, where it goes at tenfold. The 90,000 properties at risk of coastal erosion. The subsidence, I saw a map from the BGS. It's the southeastern London, and it's I think we've got an 8-fold increase in some aspects of the subsidence. The number I have is 3.6 million. And flooding, there are many different types of flooding, but flooding from coastal erosion is predicted to have a 4-fold increase over a 50-year time frame. So simple takeaway point is the profession has been, we're preoccupied, our job is to mitigate risk. It's not to become an environmental consultancy, a climate specialist, but it's to flag up risk of concern and to try and de-risk if we can. Maybe through insurance, through data, through searches, through drafting, all the tools at our disposal. But these climate-related risks are going to become more frequent and more costly to deal with. We're talking primarily about the physical risks, but also the transition risks over time, such that, it could be that 1 in 5 of the property transactions you're involved with, there's a flood risk. You'll need to understand it. You need to understand whether the property is insurable. And those other GR environmental risks are changing quite rapidly over time. I think that actually feeds back to the duty of care. If this was an amorphous, totally remote, not real risk that has a minor impact, then maybe that's a factor that will be taken into account when determining whether it's fair, just or reasonable to impose a duty of care. But when you look at the hundreds of thousands of properties that will be at risk in the coming decades, are we saying our profession should sort of turn its back on that and ignore that? I just find it inconceivable. So here are some of the stats I've just pulled together again from the ground shore map, and you just see how the number of properties multiply over time. The same goes for commercial. I think it's 1 in 3 commercial properties are at risk of flood at the moment, predicted to go to about 46% by 2070. So a lot of UK real estate, land and buildings are at risk from climate. Okay, so my background in insurance with Allianz, helping to start the London environmental insurance market. But one thing that you'll all be mindful of, or your firms will be the cost of PI. Because already, never mind with climate risk being taken into account, conveyancing is seen as a very high risk area for PI insurers. The premiums are already steep. I've got friends in law firms who are paying double-digit percentages of their gross fee income on PI. Factor in climate risk over the coming years. I think what PI insurers will wish to see over time are law firms with policies and practices and protocols and training to have a handle on this risk, particularly in the light, and this is really the game changer, climate risk data in 2022. It's now available. You're either receiving it or you will shortly be receiving it in the searches you commission. So what do you do with it? I think Stephen said you can't just sit on it. There is the case, it's known as the Bird and Bird case, 2017, Orient Field. It wasn't a climate risk case. It was a planning report case where the report was commissioned and wasn't passed on to the client. Client buys, a little bit unusual, £25 million plus residential property, finds out, or puts a deposit down to buy one rather, finds out that there's a major school academy being built sort of next door, decides not to proceed, loses the deposit, sues Bird and Bird. What's really interesting about, and Bird and Bird lose that case, and it's nearly £2 million. What's really interesting is the judge says, what should the lawyer have done with that report? That, to me, is the heart of it. And it's not to sit on it, it is to summarize it in the report on title. To read the thing. Read it, understand it, summarize the key results, the legal implications, if there's a source of additional data to look into that. Once the report has been commissioned, this is what the law firm should have done. And then seek instructions from the client. So now that climate data's there, I think it's at least worth looking at the rationale in that case to see, okay, what should we do? It's either that or close out the retainer and say, well, we're not looking at this, which I don't think's an easily defensible position with a risk that's so prominent and really immediate. But when we look at PI and the very high costs that already apply across conveyancing and this increased risk from climate, I think PI insurers will be nervous because of the novelty of the law here, to some extent, the creation of a new duty of care in a situation that hasn't been clear. There'll be some legal uncertainty. There might be quite a lot of litigation over time, and they'll be bothered about that. They'll be bothered because under SRA regulations, that PI insurance has to include uncapped defence costs. So when they are defending, certainly if it's on a commercial project where there's a climate risk that impacts, okay, well into the future potentially, but the cost of defence could be very considerable because it could well be quite complex. One other aspect to this, Stephen and I were talking about it yesterday, to me the heart of this is what's our duty of care? I mean, the Law Society, as Seb will say shortly, guidance is coming. We don't quite know when. I'm sure it'll be very thorough and rigorous when it comes. But even ahead of that, the duty of care, not everybody agrees, but there's at least a likely case that there's duty of care existing now. But when did that duty of care start? We've got white papers going back 32 years. I think that seems a little bit too far back in the past. But we announced a climate emergency in the UK. Theresa May did in 2017. What are we doing? Are we ignoring that? In a way, if we're candid, individually, some of us are ignoring it because it's so darned overwhelming and terrifying, and we're frozen by the whole thing. But as lawyers, professional advisors to our clients, what can we do? What should we do? We have to look in our own profession and say, what are our legal obligations? Is there a duty of care matched to this data that's now available? Yes, let's read it and report back to the client, and they can make a decision. Some sites, some properties, they'll not be mortgageable, nationwide and the like, they'll be too high risk, or they'll be uninsurable, or the climate reports that are out there will be saying they're maybe going to disappear into the sea, or we're only too alarmist about it, but there'll be times where clients just won't want to proceed with that purchase. It won't be a sensible thing for them to do, and that's helping them to reach that decision. I mean, insurers love opportunity. We love risk and uncertainty, and we're probably in the most innovative insurance market in the world. Climate risk is a massive concern for insurers on their traditional book of building and context insurance, that's for sure. But equally, where new risks emerge, the London market's been incredibly innovative over the years. I was at the heart of environmental insurance in the 90s with CERTA and Allianz, and getting that market going in the UK and across Europe. And equally with climate risk, insurers are starting to look at this data that's available and seeing whether they can write policies on the back of it, if you like, by benchmarking in a report today and seeing if there's a deterioration over time and various liabilities manifesting as a result of that. Can you ensure the difference? So there's some innovation coming, but the core area where it strikes is building and context insurance and insurance for subsidence risks. And within buildings and contents insurance, what we do know, we've got flood re for resi, we haven't got flood re for commercial, but we've got flood re for a potentially limited period of time. And some challenges, I think, on the insurance market, my personal view is over time, there'll probably need to be new sources of capital, together with the reinsurers and the primary insurers, to come together, massive pools of capital needed to mitigate this risk. Together with the sort of policy I was advising recently on TAN 15 in South Wales, technical advice note on flood risk and coastal erosion. And if you read a document like that, it talks about managed retreat. It talks about properties being sustainable, and they're not sustainable if they're uninsurable. Vast stretches of South Wales, which had been sort of earmarked for residential, and the same will go across the country really, where it's not going to happen, guys, because there's an assumption that a public body will come in and maintain flood defences or engineer new flood defences, and you read that guidance and actually it's quite emphatic, no, it's not going to happen. So again, as lawyers advising clients in the longer run and understanding flood defence law and flood policy, there will be some properties where there's a dangerous assumption to think that the flood defences will be maintained at someone else's dollar, where there's limited cash in the pot, and the guidance note is saying, no, managed retreat. I'm in the 65 or 70% thinking there's a duty of care, and I think it's dangerous to assume otherwise. A safer assumption is that there's a duty of care, and it's already started, and probably started a few years ago. Hard to discharge that duty where no one was giving you the data, but the data is now available on a site-specific, property-specific basis to rank individual houses and individual commercial buildings against climate risks over various projections. And when that kind of, the genie's out of the bottle, that makes it more pointed. It's kind of, you can't ignore it at that point, because there's a partial solution. There's data there that can persuade a client not to proceed with a purchase. So I think the duty's there. It's a duty to warn. It's not to become a climate expert, but it's to understand what those reports are about, particularly as they manifest on flooding and subsidence, because they're the big ones. But coastal erosion also is rapidly ramping up. I think what the PI insurers are going to want to see is that we've got a grip on this. We've got a position ahead of maybe what the Law Society is doing. We're certainly in line with the guidance that I think will be coming through to just keep abreast of it all. Because what we don't want, I think, is to kind of look inwards and not respond. I think actually, the part of the law side is looking at this, the ethical duty on us as lawyers to step up in a climate emergency and advise our clients about this. And there's all kinds of data available. The Law Society is certainly doing its part. SRA has a way to go. Thank you.